My female boss accused me of flirting to cover her affair. It happened on a Tuesday at 9:17 a.m. According to the timestamp on the calendar invite, the subject line just said, "Quick check-in." No agenda, no HR copied. I remember noticing that because it felt slightly off, but not enough to worry me. She sent those kinds of invites all the time. I got up from my desk and walked the length of the floor to her office. The carpet had just been vacuumed, and the place smelled like that faint lemon cleaner facilities used every morning. Her door was already closed when I got there. That was unusual. She usually kept it cracked. When I knocked, she said, "Come in," without looking up. She was seated behind her desk, laptop open, phone face down next to it. Her posture was stiff, shoulders pulled back, chin up. Not angry, exactly, but rehearsed, like she had practiced what she was about to say. She didn't ask me to sit right away. That should have been the first sign. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. I stood there for a second before pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. She didn't stop me, but she didn't invite me either. She folded her hands on the desk. Her nails were freshly done, pale pink, perfect. I remember noticing how still they were. "There have been concerns raised about your behavior," she said. I actually smiled a little, because it sounded so formal and out of place. "My behavior?" "Yes," she said, "specifically toward me." The smile dropped off my face. I felt heat climb up my neck, the kind that comes when you know you're about to be accused of something but don't know what yet. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said. She inhaled slowly, like she was bracing herself. "You've been crossing professional boundaries." I waited for her to explain. She didn't. "Can you give me an example?" I asked. She leaned back in her chair and finally looked me directly in the eye. "Your tone, the way you linger in my office, the messages you send on Slack after hours." My stomach tightened. I replayed every message I had sent her in my head, which wasn't hard because there weren't many. Work questions, deadlines, clarifications, nothing else. "I don't linger," I said, "and I don't message you after hours unless it's about a project." She nodded, like she'd expected that response. Intent isn't always the same as impact. That was when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a setup. She reached for her phone and turned it over, unlocking the screen. "I want to be very clear," she said. "This has made me uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. The word landed hard. It's a word you can't really argue with. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," I said carefully. "That wasn't my intention." She didn't respond to the apology. She just kept going. "You've commented on my appearance," she said. My heart started pounding. "When?" She hesitated for half a second too long. "You told me I looked nice last Thursday." I stared at her. "I said your presentation went well." She shook her head. "No, you said I looked nice." I knew exactly what she was referring to. We'd passed each other in the hallway after the department meeting. She had said, "That was a brutal room." I had said, "You handled it well." That was it. I could still hear my own voice saying it. "I didn't say that," I said. Her jaw tightened. "This is what I'm talking about. You're dismissing my experience." The air in the room felt heavier. I noticed the blinds were half closed, slats tilted down so no one outside could see in clearly. I wondered if that was intentional. "I need you to understand the seriousness of this," she continued. "If this continues, it could become an HR matter." "Continues?" I said. "I don't know what behavior you're asking me to stop." She stood up then, suddenly, pushing her chair back. "I don't want you coming into my office unless absolutely necessary," she said, "and I don't want any non-essential communication." "Okay," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. She picked up her phone again. "I've documented this conversation." That made my chest feel hollow. "Documented it how?" "Notes," she said. "Dates, instances." I almost asked to see them. But something told me not to. The way she said it made it clear they weren't for me. She opened the door, signaling the meeting was over. As I stood up, my legs felt unsteady, like I'd stood too fast. At the door, she added, "I hope we can move forward professionally." I walked back to my desk, in a fog. The office looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes earlier. But it felt different, like I was out of sync with it. I sat down and opened Slack, scrolling through my messages with her. Checking timestamps, reading every line. There was nothing there, nothing even close. At 10:02 a.m., I got an email from her. It was brief, following up on our conversation to reiterate expectations around professional boundaries. No HR copied, no details, just enough to create a paper trail. I sat there staring at the screen, my cursor blinking in the reply box. Around me, people talked about lunch plans and deadlines. Someone laughed near the printer. I didn't respond. I just minimized the window and tried to work, but my hands were shaking slightly, and every time someone walked past my desk, I wondered if they knew something I didn't. By noon, I realized one thing very clearly. Whatever was happening, it wasn't about anything I had done. I'd worked there a little over 3 years by then. Long enough to know the rhythms of the place, the unspoken rules, who to avoid near the coffee machine, and who always talked too loud on speakerphone. I was 32, single, and boring in the way most people with steady jobs are boring. I showed up early, left on time, kept my head down. She had been my manager for about 9 months. She was 40, maybe 41, divorced, 2 kids she mentioned just often enough to remind people she had a life outside the office. She dressed sharply, always looked put together, and had a way of making eye contact that felt intentional. Not warm exactly, but focused. People respected her. Some were intimidated by her. No one openly disliked her. When she first took over the team, she made a point of having one-on-ones with everyone. Mine lasted 30 minutes and stayed exactly on script. Goals, expectations, metrics, no personal talk. I liked that. It felt clean. Over time, though, she started leaning on me more than others. I handled a complicated account no one else wanted, and it performed well. I answered emails quickly. I didn't complain. That sort of thing gets noticed. She'd stop by my desk occasionally instead of messaging. Stand there with her arms crossed, ask a question, nod, leave. It never felt personal. It felt efficient. The Slack messages she mentioned in that meeting were almost all initiated by her. "Hey, can you look at this tonight?" Or, "Quick question when you have a sec." I answered because that's what you do when your boss asks. I went back through everything that afternoon. Exported the messages, took screenshots, saved them to a folder on my personal drive when I got home. It felt paranoid, but also necessary. What I didn't understand yet was how quickly things had shifted. About a month before that meeting, she'd started acting differently. Small things at first, canceling one-on-ones last minute, taking longer to respond. When she did respond, her tone was clipped, stripped of the neutral politeness it should have had before. At the time, I assumed she was busy. The department had been under pressure. Budgets, deadlines, the usual. I didn't take it personally. Then there were the meetings. She began, bringing Mark along to discussions that had always been just the two of us. Mark was a senior manager from another team, married, mid-40s, loud in meetings and quiet in hallways. He'd been around forever, the kind of guy who never seemed to get promoted but never left either. I didn't think much of it when he started showing up. Cross-functional alignment, that sort of thing. He'd sit next to her, lean in when she spoke, sometimes finish her sentences. I noticed it, but I didn't attach meaning to it. The first time something felt off was a Friday afternoon around 6:30. I was packing up when she messaged me asking if I could send over a revised report before Monday. I said sure, I'd get to it that night. A minute later, Mark messaged me separately asking the same thing, almost word for word. I replied to both. It was redundant, but not unheard of. When I sent the report later that evening, I sent it to both of them. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Mark replied with, "Thanks, man." That was it. The following Monday, she barely looked at me during the team meeting. When I spoke, she nodded without really engaging. Mark did most of the talking. I told myself I was overthinking it. Outside of work, my life was quiet. A couple of friends I saw on weekends, a gym membership I barely used, dinners alone more often than not. Work was the most structured thing I had. I cared about it probably more than I should have. That's part of why that accusation hit so hard. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was destabilizing. It reframed months of normal interactions into something sinister. After the meeting, I became hyper-aware of everything I did, where I stood, how I phrased messages, whether I smiled. I avoided her office completely. If she messaged me, I kept responses short and factual. A week passed, then 2. No further incidents, no HR email, no follow-up conversation. On the surface, things returned to normal, but underneath, the tension stayed. Then I started noticing something else. She and Mark were suddenly inseparable, lunches together, closed-door meetings that ran long, leaving around the same time. Once, I saw them in the parking garage, standing close, talking quietly. When they noticed me, they stepped apart like they'd been caught doing something wrong. I told myself it wasn't my business. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been moved into a role without my consent. Not just subordinate, but something else. A problem. A risk. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the accusation, I got copied on an email chain I shouldn't have been on. It was brief, internal, and clearly accidental. Mark had written, "We need to be careful about optics. Last thing we need is noise." She replied, "Agreed. I've already addressed it." Addressed what? A minute later, I was removed from the thread. I sat there staring at my screen, heart beating faster than it should have. It was vague enough to mean nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. That night, I went home and poured myself a drink I didn't really want. I thought about that meeting in her office, the rehearsed posture, the documented notes, the way she'd used words like impact and boundaries. I thought about how quickly a narrative could be built if someone needed it. And for the first time, a thought occurred to me that I didn't want to entertain, that the accusation hadn't been defensive or emotional or reactive. It had been strategic. I didn't have proof of anything yet, just a growing sense that I was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time and someone had decided to move me out of the way. I slept poorly that night, waking up at 3 a.m. with my mind racing, replaying conversations, trying to find the moment where things had gone wrong. There wasn't one. There never is. But something had already been set in motion, and I could feel it pressing in, even if I didn't yet know its ways shape. The first time I realized she was actively shaping something was during a team meeting in mid-May. It was a routine status update. 10 people on Zoom, cameras half on, half off. I was walking through a timeline when she interrupted me. "Let's keep it high level," she said. I paused. "It is high level," I said, not defensively, just matter of fact. She tilted her head slightly. "We don't need the extra commentary." Extra commentary. I hadn't changed how I presented anything. I wrapped it up and moved on, but I could feel eyes on me, the faint discomfort that comes when someone in authority signals you're out of line. After the meeting, Mark messaged me privately. "Hey, don't worry about it. She's just under a lot of stress." That message bothered me more than the interruption. It implied familiarity, not just between them, but over me. A few days later, she sent out a revised communication protocol. It applied to the whole team, but it read like it had been written with one person in mind. No after-hours messaging unless urgent. Limit one-on-one interactions. Loop in senior staff when possible. On paper, it looked reasonable. In practice, it isolated me. When I followed the protocol and looped Mark into a question for her, she replied curtly, and took Mark's suggestion instead of mine, even though it was essentially the same thing. When I didn't loop him in, she corrected me publicly in Slack. It was subtle. Plausible. If anyone asked, she could say she was just enforcing consistency. Then came the feedback. We had a scheduled one-on-one, the first since that meeting in her office. She kept her camera off. I turned mine on anyway. I want to talk about perception, she said. Okay, I said. There's a sense that you're overly familiar, she continued. It affects team dynamics. From who? I asked. She didn't answer directly. It's been noticed. I felt my jaw tighten. I don't understand. What behavior you're referring to? She sighed, like I was being difficult. The way you respond to me. The way you push back. I'm doing my job, I said. I push back when there are issues. She paused, then said, This is exactly what I mean. That was the moment I understood the trap. Any defense became evidence. After that, she started reframing interactions in real time. If I spoke up in a meeting, she'd say, Let's be mindful of tone. If I emailed late because she'd asked for something urgently, she'd reply the next morning copying Mark and say, Let's keep communications within working hours. Once, I apologized for a delay caused by a system outage. She responded, I appreciate accountability, as if I'd done something wrong. None of it was overt enough to challenge. Each piece on its own meant nothing. Together, it built an image. The worst part was watching her do it to my face, calmly. Without invisible emotion. No anger. No defensiveness. Just quiet control. The first clear lie came in late June. We were on a call with a client when she said, As I mentioned to you earlier, and then referenced a conversation we'd never had. I corrected her gently. We haven't discussed that yet. There was a beat of silence. Then she said, We did. Last week. Mark was on the call. So were two others. I don't think so, I said. I would remember. She didn't argue. She just said, Okay, and moved on. After the call, she messaged me. We need to align better. That kind of contradiction can come across as undermining. Undermining. Another loaded word. I scrolled back through my calendar. No meeting, no call, nothing. A few days later, HR emailed me requesting a check-in. My stomach dropped. It was scheduled for 30 minutes, with her and an HR business partner I'd never met. In the meeting, HR asked general questions at first. How was I feeling about work? Did I feel supported? Then she said, There have been some concerns raised about professional boundaries. Again. This time, it wasn't just her word. It was a process. She spoke before I could. I want to emphasize that I'm not accusing, she said. I just want to make sure we're all comfortable. Comfortable. The same word as before. HR asked if I had anything to share. I said I was confused and asked for specific examples. She listed them. Each one was distorted. A Slack message where I'd said thanks was described as excessive enthusiasm. A meeting where I disagreed was defensive. A time I'd stopped by her office because she'd asked me to was framed as unnecessary presence. I corrected the facts calmly. HR nodded, took notes, said they appreciated my perspective. At the end, HR said, We'll document this as a coaching conversation. Coaching. Another harmless word. After the call, she messaged me privately. I hope this helps reset things. I stared at the message for a long time. Reset implied fault. Implied something had gone wrong that needed correction. From that point on, I was being managed out of the narrative. She began praising others for work I'd done jointly, excluding my name. She reassigned a project I'd led for months without explanation. When I asked why, she said, Given the current situation, it's better this way. I asked what situation. She said, You know. I didn't, but I was starting to see the outline. One evening, as I was leaving, I passed Mark's office. The lights were off, but I could hear voices down the hall, hers and his, low, close. I stopped without meaning to. I can't afford this getting messy, she said. It won't, he replied. He doesn't have anything. She laughed quietly. He doesn't even know. I walked away before they saw me. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. That was the first time I considered that this wasn't just about control or ego. It was about protection. Someone had something to hide, and I was being positioned as the distraction. The problem employee. The one whose behavior needed managing. I went home and sat on my couch in the dark, replaying that overheard exchange over and over. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was confirmation of intent. The manipulation was no longer subtle to me. It was systematic, careful, designed to leave no fingerprints, and I was already inside it, whether I wanted to be or not. After that night, things accelerated. It was like once I'd overheard them, the pace changed. She stopped pretending things were normal. Meetings I used to be invited to disappeared from my calendar. Decisions were made without me and handed down after the fact. When I asked clarifying questions, she'd respond with, Let's take that offline, and then never follow up. My performance metrics were still solid. My work quality hadn't changed, but the way it was discussed had. In a quarterly review meeting, she said, You deliver, but there are interpersonal challenges we need to address. Interpersonal challenges with whom? I wanted to ask, but I already knew the answer would be vague. Mark was in that meeting too. He nodded along, occasionally adding things like, perception matters, or leadership presence is important. None of it was concrete. All of it felt rehearsed. Afterward, I emailed her asking for specific, actionable feedback. I kept it professional, careful with my wording. She didn't reply for 2 days. When she did, it was one sentence. Let's discuss in our next one-on-one. The next one-on-one got cancelled an hour before it was supposed to happen. Then came the rumor shift. It started with small things. A teammate asking me, half joking, "You staying out of trouble?" Another one going quiet when I sat down at lunch. People stopped looping me into informal conversations. One afternoon, a coworker I trusted pulled me aside and said, "Hey, just so you know, there's talk that you made her uncomfortable." My chest tightened. "Talk where?" She shrugged. "Just around. Be careful." That was when I realized the narrative had escaped her office. It was loose now. I went to HR again, this time on my own. I asked for clarity. I said I was concerned about how I was being characterized and wanted to understand what was on record. The HR partner was polite but non-committal. "We don't see this as disciplinary," she said, "more developmental." "Is there a complaint?" I asked. She hesitated. "There have been concerns." "From who?" I asked again. She smiled tightly. "We don't disclose that." I asked if there was anything in writing accusing me of misconduct. She said no. I asked if my job was at risk. She said not at this time. It was all carefully worded to reassure without committing to anything. When I left that meeting, I felt worse than before. Because now I understood the terrain. Nothing explicit would ever be said. Everything would stay just vague enough to be deniable. The escalation moved into documentation. She began sending follow-up emails after conversations, summarizing them in ways that subtly reframed what had happened. If I asked a question, the email would say I'd expressed frustration. If I disagreed, it became resistance. I started responding to every one of those emails, correcting the language, calmly, factually. It didn't help. If anything, it seemed to irritate her. Mark stopped messaging me altogether. Then, in early July, something happened that crossed from uncomfortable into alarming. I got an email from HR with the subject line, "Formal Feedback Summary." Attached was a document outlining observed behaviors and areas for improvement. My name was on it, so was hers, and Mark's, listed as an additional observer. One line stopped me cold. "Employee has demonstrated a pattern of inappropriate familiarity with supervisor, including repeated attempts to engage outside of necessary business context." It wasn't phrased as an allegation. It was phrased as a fact. I emailed HR immediately, disputing it and asking for evidence. I CC'd her. She replied before HR did. "This defensiveness is part of the issue," she wrote. "We're trying to support you." Support. Another word turned inside out. HR responded later saying they would note my disagreement and suggested we schedule a follow-up. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about how easily that sentence could be interpreted by anyone reading my file in the future, how it could follow me. The next week, she reassigned me to a different reporting line temporarily, citing the need for space. It was framed as neutral, but everyone knew what it meant. I was radioactive. The new manager was kind but distant. He treated me like someone passing through. Meanwhile, she and Mark became less careful. They arrived together more often, left together. Once, I saw her hand on his arm in the hallway. It wasn't intimate, but it wasn't nothing. People noticed, but no one said anything. I started documenting everything obsessively. Dates, times, messages, changes to my responsibilities. I kept a running log on my phone, updating it in the bathroom, in my car, at night before bed. Part of me knew it might never matter, but it was the only thing that made me feel less helpless. The breaking point came during a department-wide meeting. Someone asked a question about a delay in a project I used to own. Before I could answer, she said, "We've had some internal challenges with alignment, but we're addressing them." Alignment. Internal challenges. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. After the meeting, she pulled me aside in the hallway. "I need you to be more self-aware," she said quietly. "About what?" I asked. "About how you come across," she said. "This situation didn't have to escalate." That word again. Escalate. I looked at her and realized something had shifted in me. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else. A clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. "This situation exists because you created it," I said. Her expression hardened instantly. "Be careful," she said. That night, I went home and drafted an email I didn't send. It laid everything out. The inconsistencies, the timeline, the overheard conversation, Mark's involvement. I read it over and over, then I deleted it. I knew sending it prematurely would only confirm the story they were telling. Emotional, reactive, unstable. If I was going to do anything, it had to be with proof, and I didn't have that yet. But the escalation had reached a point where doing nothing was no longer an option. My reputation was already being shaped without me. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to stay contained. The proof didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces small enough that I almost missed what they added up to. The first piece was an IT alert. I got an automated email one Thursday morning saying my mailbox was nearing its storage limit and suggesting I archive older messages. It was routine, but it forced me to dig through emails I hadn't looked at in months. That's when I noticed something odd. There were gaps. Entire threads were missing. Not deleted, just gone. Conversations I remembered clearly, requests, follow-ups, approvals, were nowhere to be found. At first I thought I was mistaken. Memory is unreliable when you're stressed. But then I checked my local backups. The screenshots I'd saved earlier still existed. The emails they referenced didn't. I contacted IT, framing it as a technical issue. They responded that my mailbox had been accessed recently as part of a managerial review. Standard procedure, they said. No further details. Managerial review. I knew exactly who had access. That same afternoon, while looking for something else, I stumbled across a calendar anomaly. A meeting invite from 3 months earlier that had been updated after the fact. The original version showed just her and Mark. The updated version included my name, added weeks later, with the note, alignment discussion. I checked the metadata. The modification timestamp was recent. I took screenshots of everything. The second piece came from someone else. Late one evening, I got a text from the coworker who'd warned me about the rumors. She asked if I was free to talk. When I said yes, she called immediately. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said. Her voice was low, careful. "But this is getting weird." She told me that she'd been pulled into a conversation with my boss the week before, framed as concern, my emotional intensity, my misinterpretation of signals, my difficulty maintaining professional distance. "I didn't say much," she said. But then she mentioned Mark, said he'd noticed it too. I closed my eyes. "What exactly did she say?" "That you seemed attached," she said, "like you were trying to get her attention." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Did she give examples?" "She mentioned late messages," she said, "and said you sometimes looked for reasons to come by her office." I told her those messages were work-related, that she'd initiated most of them, that she'd asked me to come by. "I know," she said quickly. "That's why I'm calling. Because I've seen her ask you, and because—" She hesitated. "Because what?" I asked. "Because I've seen her and Mark together," she said. "A lot, and not just at work." I didn't interrupt. "They've been having an affair," she said. "People know, not officially, but it's not subtle anymore." There it was, said out loud, no ambiguity. She told me she'd seen them together at a hotel bar during a conference 2 months earlier, that another coworker had walked in on them in a conference room with the door locked, that someone in finance had joked about it quietly. "But then, this stuff about you started," she said, "and it felt like a redirect." I thanked her. We hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been in weeks. The third piece was accidental. A few days later, Mark forwarded me an email by mistake. He realized it almost immediately and followed up with, "Please disregard." I didn't. The email was from her, sent late at night, not through Slack, but personal Gmail. Subject line, last night. It wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. She wrote about being more careful at work, about how things were starting to look, about needing to shift attention elsewhere. One line stood out. "I've already planted the boundary issue, so we're covered." Covered. I forwarded the email to my personal account, before replying that I'd disregard it. Then I deleted my reply. Now I had it. Not just suspicion, not just pattern, a timeline. I spent the weekend organizing everything. Messages, calendar edits, HR documents, the IT notice, screenshots. I wrote out a chronology with dates and names, sticking to facts. No speculation, no emotion. Reading it back, it was almost clinical. Monday morning, I requested a meeting with HR and asked that legal be present. I didn't explain why in the request, just said it was regarding a serious concern. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday. In the meantime, she sensed something. I could tell. Her tone shifted again, this time into something brittle. She avoided me entirely. Mark stopped coming around. On Wednesday afternoon, she sent me a message asking to talk privately before the HR meeting. I didn't respond. Thursday came. I walked into the conference room with my laptop and a folder of printed documents. HR was there, so was someone from legal. She arrived last, Mark a step behind her. She looked confident, controlled. HR asked me to explain why I'd requested the meeting. I took a breath and said, "I believe I've been falsely accused of inappropriate behavior in order to deflect from an undisclosed relationship between my manager and a senior colleague." The room went very quiet. She laughed once, short and sharp. "This is exactly the kind of inappropriate inference we've been talking about." I didn't argue. I didn't look at her. I opened my laptop and started walking them through the timeline, slowly, carefully. I showed the altered calendar invite, the deleted emails, the documented feedback with vague language, the Gmail email Mark had sent me. I handed over the IT alert, the HR document with the phrased pattern. Then I said, "I also have witness statements, if needed." Mark shifted in his chair. She stopped smiling. Legal asked questions. HR took notes. No one interrupted me. When I finished, the HR partner said, "We'll need to investigate this." "For how long?" I asked. She didn't answer that. The meeting ended without resolution. But when I walked out of that room, something was different. The narrative wasn't just hers anymore. It existed on paper now, in a way that couldn't be smoothed over with words like perception or comfort. That afternoon, she didn't message me. Mark didn't either. I went home and sat on my couch, the same spot I'd sat weeks earlier, afraid and unsure. This time, I felt exhausted. Not relieved, just tired. Because proof doesn't end things. It just starts the next part. The fallout didn't come as an explosion. It came as silence. The day after the HR meeting, my calendar was empty. No meetings, no check-ins. The investigation had been labeled ongoing, which in practice meant no one wanted to touch anything connected to it. I logged on, answered emails, worked on tasks that technically still belonged to me, and waited. No one mentioned the meeting. No one asked how I was doing. A few people avoided eye contact entirely. Others were suddenly overly polite, like I'd been hospitalized and just returned. She was gone. Out of office message. PTO. No return date. Mark was still around, but quieter. He stopped joining optional meetings. When he did speak, it was clipped, careful. The absence of confrontation gave my mind too much room. I replayed every moment of the last few months, not to find fault anymore, but to understand how it had felt to be slowly reframed without knowing it. The embarrassment hit me in waves. Not just that people might have believed her, but that they might have watched it happen and said nothing. I started waking up early, around 4:30 a.m., heart already racing. My thoughts would jump straight to work before I was fully conscious. I stopped going to the gym. I stopped answering texts. My appetite went off and on, whole days where I forgot to eat, followed by nights where I ate whatever was in front of me without tasting it. I didn't feel angry the way I expected to. I felt exposed. HR checked in twice that week. Both times, they said the same thing. The investigation was proceeding, confidentiality was important, and I should continue performing my role as usual. As usual no longer existed. On Friday afternoon, legal requested a follow-up call with me. Just me. No her, no Mark. They asked clarifying questions about tone, about intent, about whether I had ever had feelings for her. No, I said. Not then, not now. They asked if I'd ever discussed my personal life with her. I said no. They asked if I'd ever been alone with her outside the office. I said no. Each question felt like a small test. I answered calmly, but afterward my hands shook. That night, I sat on my couch and tried to watch a show I'd already seen. I didn't follow it. My phone buzzed halfway through. It was her. I think this has gone too far, she wrote. We should talk. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied, please coordinate through HR. She didn't respond. The next week, the rumors shifted. I didn't hear them directly, but I felt the change. People stopped treating me like a problem and started treating me like a risk. Conversations ended when I walked up. People glanced at me, then away. One coworker finally said it out loud. This is a mess, he said quietly in the break room. They're saying leadership is involved now. Leadership, plural. That was the first time I allowed myself to feel something close to satisfaction, and it made me uncomfortable, because satisfaction meant someone else was falling. Midweek, HR scheduled separate meetings with her, with Mark, and with me. Mine was last. When I joined the call, the HR partner looked tired. Legal was there again. They told me the investigation had uncovered policy violations. They didn't specify which ones yet. They said interim measures were being considered. I asked if the accusations against me were being withdrawn. There was a pause. They are not substantiated, HR said carefully. Not substantiated, not false, not retracted, just unsupported. I felt a tightness in my chest that surprised me. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear something cleaner. They said I would be reassigned back to my original reporting line, effective immediately. I asked if anything would be put in writing clearing my record. They said they were reviewing documentation. After the call, I closed my laptop and sat still for a long time. I thought I'd feel relief. I didn't. I felt hollowed out, like something essential had been handled too roughly and left damaged. That afternoon she returned. No announcement, no explanation. She was just suddenly on Slack again, active, visible. Her status was green. She didn't message me. I saw Mark go into her office and close the door. 20 minutes later, he came out alone, face tight, eyes unfocused. By the end of the day, it was obvious something had broken between them. The ease was gone. Whatever arrangement they'd had was under scrutiny now, and they knew it. That night, I got a call from HR after hours. They told me she had been placed on administrative leave pending further review. I thanked them and hung up. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. I went for a walk, the first one in days. It was dark, quiet, the kind of evening where the air feels heavy. I walked without direction, letting my thoughts come and go. I thought about how quickly my sense of myself had changed, how I'd gone from competent and steady to defensive and hyper-aware, how easily I'd begun to doubt my own memory. I realized then that even if everything was resolved perfectly on paper, something permanent had already happened internally. I didn't trust the system anymore, not really. The next morning, Mark resigned. No explanation, just an all-hands email wishing him well. People whispered, speculated, acted surprised. No one apologized to me. A week later, HR confirmed that the accusations against me would not be included in my personnel file. They framed it as a procedural cleanup, a formality. They didn't acknowledge the damage. By then, the emotional weight had settled into something heavier than anger. It was grief, not for her, not even for the job exactly, for the version of myself that believed if I stayed professional and quiet, things would be fair. That version didn't exist anymore, and I knew, even before anything else happened, that I wouldn't be able to stay there much longer. The consequences didn't land where I expected them to. They didn't come down hard on her, not publicly, not in the way people imagine when they think about accountability. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. She stayed on administrative leave for 3 weeks. During that time, her name disappeared from meeting invites and org charts like she'd never existed. When she came back, it was quiet. HR sent a short email saying she would be transitioning into a non-people management role effective immediately. It was framed as a strategic shift. No mention of policy, no mention of why. She no longer managed anyone. She no longer sat near our floor. She worked remotely most days. Mark was gone entirely. His departure was treated as unrelated. Personal reasons, someone said. Better opportunity, someone else guessed. The truth didn't matter. He was erased. On paper, I was restored. I got my projects back. My original manager checked in and asked how I was holding up, but only once. My performance review went through unchanged, though it was noticeably shorter than usual. HR sent a follow-up email thanking me for my cooperation during the investigation. That was it. The system closed the loop and moved on. The office didn't. People were polite, but there was a thinness to it. Conversations stayed surface level. I was no longer invited into informal planning discussions. When leadership was mentioned, people glanced at me briefly, then changed the subject. I'd gone from liability to reminder. One afternoon, I overheard two coworkers talking near the elevators. One said, "I still don't understand what actually happened." The other replied, "Honestly, I don't want to know." That summed it up. The story had become inconvenient, and inconvenient stories don't spread. They stall. My boss at a distance avoided me completely. When we crossed paths on a video call once, she kept her eyes on the screen, voice neutral, professional. She never addressed what had happened. Not to me, not to anyone, as far as I knew. I wasn't sure whether that was shame or strategy. HR asked me if I wanted to file a formal complaint. I said no. Not because I forgave her, not because I thought it wasn't serious enough, but because I could see how that road ended. More documentation. More quiet conversations, more careful language that protected the institution first. I'd already paid enough. Instead, I started noticing how my name traveled. A recruiter reached out to me on LinkedIn for a role I was qualified for. When I mentioned it to a coworker, he hesitated and said, "If you use this place as a reference, just be careful who they talk to." Careful. That word again. I asked HR for a neutral reference letter. They provided one, full of generic praise, stripped of detail. It was better than nothing. It wasn't confidence. In meetings, I began to hold back. Not because I lacked ideas, but because I'd learned how easily tone could be reinterpreted. I stopped pushing. I stopped correcting. I let small mistakes slide. People noticed. One manager said to me, "You've been quieter lately." "I'm focusing," I said. He nodded, like that made sense. What actually happened was that my sense of safety in speaking had been recalibrated. I'd learned that clarity could be dangerous, that initiative could be reframed as intent. Externally, nothing was wrong. Internally, everything was filtered. About 2 months after she returned, she resigned. Again, no announcement. Her name simply disappeared one day. A few people messaged me privately, asking if I knew. I said no. It was the truth. Someone joked, "Guess HR finally did something." I didn't laugh. By then, the damage was diffuse, spread out across months, across impressions that never quite corrected themselves. I wasn't accused anymore, but I wasn't trusted the same way either, not fully. Leadership changed how they interacted with me. Conversations were more formal. Emails were carefully worded. I was never alone with anyone senior anymore. There was always someone else CC'd, someone else on the call. I understood why. It didn't make it hurt less. Outside the company, the consequences showed up in subtler ways. I found myself rehearsing explanations in my head for future interviews, trying to figure out how to describe that period without sounding bitter, defensive, or vague. None of the options felt right. I became more guarded socially, too. When people asked about work, I gave surface answers. I stopped venting. I stopped trusting that context would protect me. Once, at a friend's dinner party, someone made a joke about workplace drama. I laughed along, then realized my hands were clenched in my lap. I hadn't noticed the tension until it was pointed out by my own body. 3 months after everything resolved, my company announced a reorganization. New roles, new opportunities. I was eligible for a promotion on paper. I didn't apply. The thought of stepping closer to visibility, to power, to rooms where narratives mattered more than truth made my chest tighten. Instead, I started quietly looking elsewhere. I took calls during lunch breaks, updated my resume late at night. Each time I described my responsibilities, I avoided mentioning her name, Mark's name, the investigation. I stuck to facts that couldn't be questioned. A recruiter asked why I was leaving. "I'm looking for a healthier environment," I said. She nodded, didn't press. That was the first time I realized how common that answer was. Externally, the consequences wrapped themselves in silence and distance. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to as injustice. Just a narrowing of space. I was still employed, still paid, still technically respected. But I was no longer at ease. The institution had absorbed the shock and redistributed it quietly. No single person held responsibility, no apology was owed, no wrong had been officially done. And yet, my career had a visible seam in it now. A before and after that couldn't be undone. I started to understand that consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like subtraction. Less trust, less openness, less willingness to take risks. Externally, I'd survived. Internally, something had been taken, and no one was going to give it back. The psychological impact didn't announce itself. It crept in quietly, disguising itself as adjustment. At first I told myself I was just being cautious, more thoughtful, more aware. That sounded mature, even healthy. But over time, the caution hardened into something else. I started second-guessing everything I wrote. An email would sit in drafts for 20 minutes while I reread and removing anything that could be interpreted as tone. Exclamation points disappeared, adverbs vanished. Even neutral phrases like just checking in felt risky. I'd rewrite them until they sounded stiff and distant. Slack became worse. I stopped using emojis entirely. I answered questions, but I never initiated conversation unless absolutely necessary. If someone didn't respond right away, I assumed I'd said something wrong. I knew it wasn't rational. That didn't matter. In meetings, I monitored my body language. Hands flat on the table, no leaning forward, no interrupting, even when interruption was normal. If someone misunderstood me, I let it go. Correcting people felt dangerous now. The version of myself that used to think out loud was gone. At night, my brain replayed conversations I'd already had, searching for missteps. A raised eyebrow, a pause that lasted too long, a word that could have been replaced with another word. Sleep became shallow and fragmented. I'd wake up tense, jaw clenched, shoulders tight, like I'd been bracing against something all night. I started having stress dreams about work, but not dramatic ones. No yelling. No confrontations, just endless meetings where I was trying to explain something and no one seemed to hear me. During the day, I felt detached, like I was watching myself perform a role rather than inhabiting it. I did what was required. Nothing more. Friends noticed before I did. "You seem flatter," one of them said over drinks. "Tired," I said. He studied me. "This job is messing with you." I shrugged. I didn't want to open the door. Once you start explaining something like that, it takes over the conversation. And I was tired of explaining. Dating became difficult in a way I hadn't expected. On the surface, nothing had changed. But internally, I'd lost some basic assumption that people act in good faith. When someone asked personal questions, I answered vaguely. When they complimented me, I deflected. When they showed interest, I looked for the angle. What did they want? What were they projecting? I didn't trust my read on situations anymore. One night, I caught myself apologizing repeatedly during a disagreement that didn't require it. The other person finally said, "You don't have to keep saying sorry. I'm not accusing you of anything." The words hit harder than they should have. I realized how deeply the accusation had burrowed into me. Even after being cleared, even after proof, I still felt like I was one misstep away from being misunderstood again. At work, I avoided being alone with anyone behind closed doors. If a meeting was scheduled one-on-one, I asked to move it to a conference room or add someone else. I told myself it was about transparency. In truth, it was about fear. Once my manager suggested grabbing coffee to talk through a project. My stomach dropped. "Can we loop in Alex too?" I asked. He looked surprised, then nodded. "Sure." I hated myself a little for that. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because of what it revealed. I no longer trusted neutral situations. I began to notice how much of my energy went into managing perception rather than doing the work itself. It was exhausting. I started therapy around that time, telling myself it was just to talk things through. In the first session, I described the situation clinically, dates, events, outcomes. The therapist listened quietly. When I finished, she asked, "How did it make you feel?" I opened my mouth and realized I didn't have an answer ready. I'd spent months staying factual, composed, credible. Feeling had been postponed indefinitely. When I finally tried to describe it, my voice caught in a way that surprised me. The word that came out was unsafe. Saying it out loud felt embarrassing. Dramatic. But it was accurate. The workplace had stopped feeling like a neutral environment and started feeling like something that could turn on me without warning. That awareness didn't switch off just because the specific people were gone. The therapist said something simple that stuck with me. When someone rewrites your intentions, it attacks your sense of self. That explained why the damage felt deeper than the situation itself. It wasn't just professional. It was personal. I'd always thought of myself as someone with clear boundaries. Respectful, direct, reliable. Those traits had been turned into liabilities in someone else's story. Even after being vindicated, I found myself wondering, what if they were partly right? What if I'd missed something? What if my normal way of interacting really was too much? I knew that line of thinking was unfair. I also knew it was happening anyway. I became more withdrawn, less expressive, safer. That safety came at a cost. I felt smaller. There was a moment, months later, when a junior colleague thanked me for helping them through a difficult task. They said, "You're really supportive." My immediate reaction was panic. I laughed it off, said it was nothing, changed the subject. Later, alone, I felt a sharp, unexpected sadness. Being seen as supportive had once felt like a good thing. Now it felt like a risk. That's when I understood how thoroughly the experience had reshaped my internal rules. I no longer asked myself, is this the right thing to do? I asked, how could this be interpreted if someone wanted to twist it? That question followed me everywhere. It followed me into interviews, into conversations, into decisions that should have been simple. Even as I planned my exit from the company, even as I imagined something new, I carried that vigilance with me. It wasn't tied to her anymore, or to Mark, or even to that specific workplace. It was lodged inside me now. The hardest part was realizing that nothing external could fully undo that. No apology would rewind it. No policy change would erase the memory of how easily reality could be bent. I'd done everything right, and it still hadn't protected me. That knowledge didn't make me cynical exactly. It made me careful in a way that felt permanent. I wasn't broken. I was altered. And I knew that before I could make any real decision about my future, I had to accept that the person who'd entered that office months ago didn't exist anymore. Who I was now had been shaped by what happened, whether I liked it or not. The decision didn't come from a single moment. It settled in slowly, like sediment. I'd been interviewing casually for a few months by then. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just conversations. Low stakes. I told myself I was exploring options, but in truth, I was measuring how much of myself I could still offer without feeling exposed. One afternoon, after a third-round interview that went well, I closed my laptop and realized my hands were shaking. Not from nerves, from relief. Relief that the conversation was over, that I hadn't said anything wrong, that I hadn't been misunderstood. That wasn't how opportunity was supposed to feel. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and opened a blank document. I wrote 2 headings: stay and leave. Under stay, I listed the obvious things: stability, familiarity, decent pay. Under leave, I wrote something less concrete: the chance to reset. I stared at the screen for a long time. The word reset felt dishonest. There was no resetting what had happened, but there was choosing where I carried it next. The next day at work, something small happened that finalized it. In a meeting, a senior leader asked for volunteers to take ownership of a high-visibility initiative. It was the kind of thing I would have raised my hand for without thinking a year earlier. I was qualified. I had the bandwidth. People glanced in my direction, waiting. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, not because I couldn't do it, because I didn't want to be seen doing it. That was the moment I understood I was already gone. 2 weeks later, I accepted an offer. I didn't negotiate hard. I didn't push for more. I just wanted out cleanly. The role was similar, the company smaller, the structure flatter, no direct competitors, no shared leadership, a fresh org chart with no ghosts in it. When I told HR I was resigning, they responded with polite surprise. They asked if anything could be done to change my mind. No, I said, and for the first time in a long while the word came easily. My manager asked for feedback. I kept it brief. I said I was looking for a different environment. I didn't mention her, or Mark, or the investigation. I could see the relief on his face when I didn't. People don't want truth. They want closure without responsibility. I gave 2 weeks' notice and worked them out quietly. I documented handoffs, wrapped up loose ends, kept everything professional, no speeches, no explanations. On my second-to-last day, she messaged me. I heard you're leaving, she wrote. I stared at the message. It was the first direct communication from her in months. Yes, I replied. There was a pause, then, I hope there are no hard feelings. I felt something rise in me, sharp and immediate. Not anger, something cleaner. There are, I typed, then I deleted it. Instead, I wrote, I'm focused on what's next. She didn't respond. On my last day, HR sent a goodbye email wishing me well. A few coworkers messaged privately. Some sounded genuine, some sounded cautious. One said, I'm glad you're getting a fresh start. I didn't correct her. When I logged off for the final time, there was no rush of emotion, no release, just a quiet sense of finality, like closing a door that had been open too long. I took a week off between jobs. No travel, no plans. I slept late, went for walks, cooked actual meals. The first few days, my body stayed tense, like it was waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing did. At the new job, my first week was intentionally slow. Introductions, systems, light onboarding tasks. People were friendly in an unguarded way. Meetings were messy, opinions overlapped. No one seemed afraid of being misunderstood. The first time someone disagreed with me openly, I felt a flash of panic. Then nothing happened. The conversation moved on. The disagreement existed without consequence. It felt unreal. Still, the decision I'd made wasn't just about leaving a company. It was about how I would operate going forward. I made rules for myself. Not reactive ones, but deliberate ones. I decided I would never again stay quiet to protect a narrative that wasn't mine. If something felt off, I would address it early, directly, and in writing. I wouldn't wait for patterns to form around me. I decided I would trust my memory, my intent, my internal sense of reality, even if someone else tried to rewrite it. I decided that if a place required me to shrink to be safe, it wasn't a place I would stay. Those decisions weren't dramatic. They didn't come with speeches or declarations. They showed up in small choices, speaking up sooner, asking for clarity, naming discomfort instead of absorbing it. And maybe most importantly, I decided I wouldn't carry her voice with me anymore. For a long time, I'd heard her words in my head when I drafted emails or spoke in meetings. Tone, perception, boundaries. I'd internalized her framing even after she was gone. Letting that go was an active process. It didn't happen all at once. Sometimes, even now, I feel the old hesitation, the pause before I speak, the instinct to soften, to retreat. When that happens, I remind myself of something simple. I know what I did. I know who I am. That has to be enough. Leaving didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the anxiety or the vigilance overnight, but it drew a line, a clear one. Before, I'd been trying to survive inside a story someone else had written about me. Now, I was choosing to write my own again. That was the permanent decision, not just to leave a job, but to stop living defensively, to stop assuming guilt, to stop allowing someone else's manipulation to define the boundaries of my life. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could decide what happened next. And for the first time since that morning in her office, that decision felt entirely mine. The aftermath didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a long exhale that took months to complete. At my new job, things settled into a rhythm. Not perfect, not magical, just normal. People missed deadlines, meetings ran long, someone occasionally said the wrong thing and apologized without it turning into a file or a narrative. I did my work, spoke when I needed to, and went home. For a while, I kept waiting for the floor to drop out. Every performance check-in felt like it might hide something. Every vague comment made my stomach tighten, but nothing came of it. Over time, the tension eased, not because I told myself I was safe, but because experience kept confirming it. Slowly, my body stopped bracing. I noticed it one evening when I realized I hadn't thought about her in days. Not consciously, not defensively. She'd simply receded from something immediate into something distant. The story still existed, but it no longer lived at the front of my mind. A few months in, my new manager gave me direct feedback in a one-on-one. He said, "You're solid, but you tend to undersell your point. You don't have to pull back so much." I nodded, thanked him, and went back to my desk. Then I sat there, hands on the keyboard, and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because he was right or wrong, but because the feedback was about work. Not intention, not tone, not who I was as a person, just the work. That distinction mattered more than I'd realized. Occasionally, something would pull me back. A headline about workplace misconduct, a joke about HR, a conversation where someone said, "You never really know what's going on behind closed doors." Each time I felt a flicker of recognition, but it didn't consume me anymore. It passed through. I didn't follow up on what happened to her after she left. I heard fragments through old connections, consulting, a new company, a reframed narrative. None of it surprised me. People like her rarely disappear. They relocate. What surprised me was how little I cared. The need for vindication had faded. Not because I'd forgiven her, but because my life no longer revolved around the wound she'd created. I wasn't interested in watching consequences unfold from afar. I'd already paid enough attention. About a year after everything, I ran into someone from my old company at a coffee shop. We talked politely, exchanged updates. Then, awkwardly, he said, "That whole situation back then was rough." "Yeah," I said. He hesitated. "For what it's worth, people know now what really happened." I looked at him. "Do they?" He nodded. "More than you think." I believed him, and I also knew it didn't change anything. Reputation repairs itself slowly, unevenly, and often without your participation. By the time it does, you're usually somewhere else. After he left, I sat with my coffee and felt a strange calm. I hadn't needed his validation. It was nice, maybe, but unnecessary. That felt like progress. The biggest change showed up in places I didn't expect. I started laughing more easily, not forced laughter, the kind that comes out before you can stop it. I started making plans again instead of defaulting to staying home. I reconnected with people I'd gone quiet with during that period, explaining just enough without turning it into a confession. I trusted myself again. Not blindly, but reasonably. The vigilance never fully disappeared. I doubt it ever will. Experiences like that leave grooves. But it softened. It stopped running the show. Sometimes, when I think about that first meeting in her office, I notice how sharply I remember the details. The closed door, the phrasing, the way she framed discomfort as fact. Those memories don't hurt anymore. They feel like reference points, markers of something I survived. I don't tell the story often. When I do, I keep it simple. I don't dramatize it. I don't use it as a warning or a lesson. I just state what happened. People usually react strongly. Outrage, sympathy, advice I didn't ask for. I let them. What they don't see is the quieter truth. That the worst part wasn't the accusation or even the fear of losing my job. It was the slow erosion of self-trust. Regaining that took longer than everything else combined. I rebuilt it through small acts, saying no when something felt wrong, saying yes when something felt right, speaking plainly, writing things down, leaving places that required me to contort myself to fit. Over time, those acts added up. Now when I walk into a room, I don't scan it for threat first. I scan it for purpose. When I speak, I don't pre-apologize. I let the words land and deal with them if I need to. I still believe in professionalism, in boundaries, in respect, but I no longer confuse those with silence. The person who walked into her office that morning believed the system would protect him if he stayed within the lines. That belief is gone. What replaced it is less comforting, but more solid. I know now that systems protect themselves first, that narratives are tools, that truth needs documentation, witnesses, and timing to survive. I also know that I can survive being misunderstood. That matters. The aftermath isn't about closure. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, no moment where everything was set right. It's about integration. What happened became part of me, but it didn't get to define me. It sharpened my awareness without turning me brittle. It taught me caution without forcing me into hiding. If I could speak to that earlier version of myself standing in her office with his stomach tightening, I wouldn't tell him everything would work out. I'd tell him this instead. You're about to lose some illusions. It's going to hurt. You're going to doubt yourself in ways you've never had to before. But you're going to keep your core intact. You're going to learn where your boundaries actually are. And one day, this will be a chapter you can close without flinching. That's the real aftermath. Not justice, not revenge, continuity. Life went on. I went on with it. And that turned out to be enough.